Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Freely Nourished, the podcast that empowers you to break the cycle of dieting by teaching you to nourish your body well. I am your host, registered dietitian Erin Casey, and I am also the owner of New You Nutrition Counseling, where we believe that you can reach any of your healthcare goals at just about any body size. So if you are ready to let go of that toxic cycle of dieting, of restriction, and then binging, and then shame, come to us. We have lots of ways to serve you. Um, we have, of course, our bread and butter, which is one-on-one counseling. That will be with me. You can book a free discovery call on the website. It's literally free. It's 15 minutes to just chat through any questions that you may have about nutrition, but more importantly, kind of what it is that we offer. So if you are looking for something that's more of a group format, we have that. We also have lots of digital products and kind of masterclass style things that you can do basically on your own time. We also, like I said, we have the one-on-one counseling, but there's a lot that goes into that. A lot of people have questions about, how often do I see you? How much does it cost? Those kinds of things. And I'm happy to sit down and chat with you and kind of what it might look like for your specific situation. So, like I said, it's a quick 15-minute call, but you usually get a lot out of it. And kind of we set up together a plan forward and decide, if it's really what you're wanting to do, if you're ready for it, all of that good fun stuff. So, free discoveries call, all the stuff, all the information on it will be linked below as always. And honestly, today I don't want to babble on too much about promo stuff because I want to get right into the meat and potatoes of the episode, which is all of these new weight loss injectable medications. So, Ozempic, Weygovy, Semiglutide, Mounjaro, Zepbound. There's a lot of them out there now, and they hit the market relatively recently and relatively quickly. I actually did an episode about Ozempic and Weygovy earlier this year, and I actually took it down. So if you were looking for it and you can't find it, you're not crazy. I actually took it down because there's been new information that has come to light. And I want to kind of talk about the update now. It's just kind of like anything, as these medications are out and available for a longer period of time, we learn a lot more about them. And I kind of want to give you the update today, but I also didn't feel great about while that episode, when it aired, was accurate and up to date, I don't love the idea that somebody could search for it now and find it kind of out of context with this episode. So we're basically just kind of going back to the drawing board and talking about all of it. So, today we'll talk about kind of, what are these medications? How do they work? How long have they been around? What does the clinical data say about them? I'm really kind of framing this in the context of questions that I get asked frequently about these medications. So, those would be, kind of what are they? Are they safe? There's been some bad press around them. We'll talk about that a little bit too. And then just kind of, general questions like, do I need to be on it for the rest of my life? What happens if you come off of it? Is it safe in the context of pregnancy? All of that kind of stuff. So we'll definitely we'll touch on all of those things. And of course, as always, if you guys have questions, leave them in the comments. I love to address questions. Sometimes it's something that I can type out a brief response because it's just something I didn't quite get to in the context of this episode, but sometimes it actually warrants a whole new episode in and of itself, and it gives me content ideas. So, and I love that. I love that when you all inspire me to do more work. Which is something I'm going to be doing the work anyway. Let's be clear. It helps to direct it, and I don't have to always create all the ideas all the time. So let's get into it. Kind of what are these medications? So there's really only two. And I know everybody's like, well, wait, what? I've heard all of these different terms. There's really only two. There is semaglutide, which is Ozempic and Weygovy. Those are actually the exact same medication. And like semaglutide is the generic name. Weygovy is branded for weight loss. Ozempic is branded for diabetes. All of those, semaglutide, Ozempic, Weygovy, are the exact same medication. It is the exact same drug. They are literally in different colored pens with different dosages. So when Ozempic hit the market, I'm going to get to the others here in a second, but when Ozempic hit the market, I think I should have written this in my notes, but it was either 2017 or 2018, something in that area. It was semaglutide was branded as Ozempic. It was available in 0.25 0.5 and 1 milligram doses. And that is still the case. That is what Ozempic is available as now. That is what generic semaglutide is available at now. Then what they learned is, through the context of clinical trials, and even just kind of after the Ozempic was released, we saw, weight loss was a common effect that a lot of our patients had. And it was people who were wanting to lose weight. So, it was branded for diabetes, but people were also finding that they lost weight. So, of course, the makers of Ozempic were like, could we brand this as a weight loss medication? So they began studying it as a weight loss medication. So they studied it basically in people who did not have diabetes. So, the trial ran through, basically healthy individuals who they had to be either classified as overweight or obese. If you've been around for a while, I don't love those terminologies, but clinically that's what was done in the trial, right? So they had to have a BMI of at least 30 or higher. And sure enough, but no presence of diabetes, no cardiovascular disease, none of that, so that there wasn't anything confounding what they were seeing. And sure enough, we saw weight loss in those patients. The dose of the Wegovy, however, is higher. So you typically still titrate up from the 0.25, 0.51, but then the Wegovy goes higher to a 1.7 and a 2.4 milligram dose. And as you might expect, that the higher the doses get, the more dramatic the weight loss. So the goal for the clinical trials was to get as many people as possible on that highest dose possible. I will say, and we're going to circle back to this in a minute, not everybody tolerates those higher doses. And that has kind of come into actually a supply chain issue for a lot of providers here recently. And we're going to kind of get into what that means. But basically, for now, Ozempic, semaglutide, Ozempic, and Wegovy, all the same medications. They're literally just at different doses. So kind of all of the things that apply to one apply to all. Then we have tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro and Zepbound, which is the newest one. So very similar story here, right? Mounjaro was FDA approved for diabetes. Again, they saw, look at that, that a lot of our patients are losing weight, studied it for weight loss, and then sure enough, Zepbound was released as well. I'm actually less familiar with the dosing, but my understanding is that it's similar. They are the exact same compound. So they all are tirzepatide, which there's a slight difference in the mechanism of action of those two, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But my understanding is that between the dosing between Mounjaro and Zepbound is that the dosing schematic is very similar in that the Zepbound actually has a higher dose range compared to the Mounjaro. But again, so basically people are thinking there's like 5 or 6 medications. There's really only 2. They're branded differently. They're made by the same company, but branded as 2 different medications, for marketing purposes and prescribing purposes. And like I said, the doses are slightly different, but same compound that you're injecting. So what are they, right? So Ozempic is just a straight, what we call GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide 1 agonist. That is a bunch of gobbledygook that just basically means it acts like it activates a receptor in your body, that it's primarily a fullness indicator. So what it does is it kind of slows gastric emptying, which can definitely beneficially impact blood sugar, in the sense that everything in your stomach is not rushing to your small intestine, is not rushing to your bloodstream. It's slowing that process down. That does a couple of things. One, it actually slows down intake, right? So it slows down how hungry you get and how quickly, and improves what we call satiety, or kind of that fullness satisfaction factor after meals. So that in a way, sometimes people are just eating less, or they're not eating to like a point of feeling overly full. They're kind of more in tune with their natural hunger and satiety cues. And that slows down kind of how much glucose or carbohydrate or, whatever they've eaten is getting into their bloodstream at one time. So that kind of slows down the need to regulate the blood sugar. There's some evidence too that it might kind of help produce a little bit more insulin in response to glucose. My understanding of that data is actually a little fuzzy. or sorry, not my understanding isn't fuzzy, but from what I understand, the data is a little fuzzy. It's not super clear to what, and it probably is just because it varies person to person. It depends, especially in the context of diabetes. Everybody's pancreas is able to produce a different amount of insulin. That response to glucose is going to be different person to person. So it's kind of all over the map from what I have read. But my understanding is that, they're trying to kind of tease apart that mechanism. But the primary way it works is it helps to, or I guess the way it works for weight loss anyway, is that it slows down gastric emptying. So your stomach literally stays fuller for longer. You get fuller faster, so you eat less food, right? And that's kind of the end of it in terms of what we know from weight loss. There's some evidence that it might improve insulin sensitivity if insulin resistance is an issue, but again, it's just kind of the data is kind of fuzzy. I'll say that there's evidence in rodents that happens, but we don't have the matching data in humans, and to an extent, that's going to take some time for us to get. So it's not, it's not that it's not happening. It's just kind of we can't always say that like that alone improves insulin sensitivity, if that makes sense. But it definitely slows down gastric emptying. It improves that feeling of fullness and satisfaction. It also reduces what we call food noise. So food noise is kind of a term that we've coined that it's a hallmark of insulin resistance, but it can arise from other things. So it is basically kind of that like constant preoccupation with food where like you just ate, but you're hungry again. And, that can happen if you've not eaten a very big meal or not had enough protein or enough fiber, other factors, but it's just kind of this constant gnawing for food, and never feeling quite full, never feeling quite satisfied, even if your meals are balanced. And that's the key, right? Because I mean, a lot of us have this constant gnawing for food, and a lot of us have, this inability to feel full, but a lot of times our meals aren't really balanced. And by that, I mean, sometimes people have cut carbs, and thinking that it's going to help them lose weight. That's the best way to trigger sugar cravings that I've ever seen, is to cut carbs out of your diet or follow a low carb diet. But assuming you have a carb, a protein, and some source of fiber, whether that's like a fruit or a vegetable, or the carb source itself is a good source of fiber. If you've got, carb, protein, fiber at your meal, you have adequate portions, adequate calories, and you still just cannot get full, then it's time to start taking a look at insulin resistance. Um, and these medications, because they help with that satiety factor, really seem to help with folks who struggle with that food noise factor. Um, Obviously, there's lots of clinical data, and now we have 5 years of it being kind of, or I guess almost 6 years now, of it being out in the quote unquote wild, of Ozempic working really, really well for both diabetes and for weight management. That said, there's definitely some drawbacks, right? So if this thing is zapping your appetite, that may or may not be beneficial for you, right? Um, I will actually, I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Sorry, I didn't write this down as flowy as I would like for it, but that's Ozempic, Mounjaro. I'm sorry, Ozempic, Weygovy, and like semaglutide. That's that whole camp of medications. Then the tirzepatide, the Mounjaro, and the Zepbound they're a GLP-1 agonist, so they do all of that. Plus, they are a GIP agonist. And to be perfectly honest with you, GIP is just, whoops, knocked myself down there. GIP is another peptide. They're called incretins. So it's basically it functions very similarly to GLP-1. It's really not all that different. It To my understanding is that it helps a little bit with nutrient uptake as well. Again, my understanding is like how much that really improves insulin sensitivity, I don't know. But it definitely helps with kind of, not feeling full. It helps slow down gastric emptying, which slows down uptake, which can also slow down, blood sugar spikes and things like that. It basically gives your body time to keep up or catch up. And there's also a potential that it could help your body produce some more insulin if it's kind of lacking in that glucose response. That's kind of complicated, and that really only applies to folks who have diabetes. So I'm going to kind of skip over that part for now. But again, if you want more info on it, you let me know. I just don't want to talk your all's ear off with neuro or with pharmacology that really isn't relevant to the questions you have about the medication. Um, Ozempic, Wegovy, semaglutide, it's just GLP-1. Tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro and Zepbound, it's GLP-1 plus GIP. So it's just two different targets essentially. But it basically it's kind of like a double whammy. It accomplishes the same thing. Um, but it's doing it by two different avenues, if that makes sense. Um, Clinically, what we see, like I said, these work for weight loss. They work great for diabetes management too. Um, the problem that they present is that they are slowing down your digestive tract and they are zapping your hunger cues, which is kind of like you just said, that's how they work. Yeah, that's how they work, and sometimes that's the problem. Right. So by slowing down your gastric emptying, it can put you at risk for constipation. It can certainly put you at risk for some nausea, which most people who take these medications do feel nauseous at some point. It's just a matter of kind of how much nausea is bearable for you. It can also, in extreme cases, if your intake has gone down way too far, if you're kind of genetically predisposed, it can cause things like either gastroparesis or bowel obstructions, kind of really problematic things that I think have kind of scared a lot of people in recent times. Um, I think kind of from what I have seen clinically, most people, to be honest with you, do very well on these medications. They really do. I will say that, and again, I'm much more familiar with the semaglutide side of this than the tirzepatide, but my understanding is that actually tirzepatide has far fewer GI complications than the semaglutide. Just because it's at a lower dose, but it's kind of hitting that double whammy. So my understanding is that there's actually far fewer GI side effects from Mounjaro and Zepbound than there are from Ozempic and Wegovy. That said, particularly with the Ozempic and the Weygovy, or I guess the Weygovy really, in trying to get people to those higher doses. A lot of people really don't tolerate the higher doses. A lot of people are at the like 0.25, zero point 0.5, and 1 milligram dose, and that's where they kind of choose to stay. Because if they try to go up from there, they do feel quite nauseous, or they do realize that they're not eating at all. And that's, of course, not the goal, right? Like we want you to eat. You need to be able to be hungry enough and to be able to eat enough without feeling full and stuffed and crampy and uncomfortable, to nourish your body and kind of, give your body the nourishment that it actually needs. And kind of a lot of times at those higher doses, because of the nausea, because of the constipation, people just they just really don't tolerate that higher dose, so they come back down to the lower doses. And that's actually kind of created I don't know if you all have heard of these really mass shortages that we've had in these medications. A lot of times providers won't write them, or they'll only write one or the other depending on the circumstances at that time, and kind of where the shortages lie, because they're worried that, if everybody who's taking these medications for weight loss is taking the same dose as the people who are taking it for diabetes, that creates a critical shortage at those lower doses. And the people who are taking it for diabetes, I think we all can kind of agree that that's a much more, that's more critical, right? We need people who are using it to manage their blood sugar, using it to manage their diabetes. They need to be able to have access to this medication over the people who are taking it for weight loss. So what's happening is kind of those lower doses are in short supply, and again, it varies, state by state. It varies even like area of a state by state. It varies, even like day to day, week to week, that kind of thing. But providers may be, you may start on Mounjaro and then have to switch to semaglutide and go back and forth, and that's why. It's because there's a lot of shortage going on. My understanding, so these are Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are the two drug companies, and they've both built like big plants to help keep up with the demand, but they weren't prepared for that when these medications went public. So I think relief for that part of it is coming. It's just that they literally had to build factories to make just these medications, and we're getting there. But I say all that to say that like sometimes the kind of the weight loss dose of these medications is not well tolerated. I will say that the tirzepatide is tolerated significantly better than the semaglutide. I will say that. But there's kind of the same, again, their mechanisms are so similar that there's quite a bit of similarity in the risk. Um, there's also been a lot of kind of scare about pancreatitis, thyroid cancers, things like that. Um, to address those very briefly, my understanding is that, particularly with the medullary thyroid cancer, that is something that has only appeared in rodents, but is not appear. We have not seen a single instance of it in humans. That said, obviously, thyroid cancer is really scary and a really big risk, and certainly not something for most people that would be worth it, just to take for a weight loss medication. So you should be screened with any family history of thyroid cancer, and your doctor or whoever's prescribing it should be asking you quite a few questions about that to make sure that that is not a risk for you. That said, my understanding, again, I don't think we've seen a case of thyroid cancer from these medications in humans. It's more of a preventative measure, because we did see it in rodents, and again, where it's an abundance of caution type of thing, right? The other thing, so pancreatitis, honestly similar. We saw it in rodents. There's certainly been instances of it in humans, but I will say it is quite rare. Before I pulled up, this podcast, obviously I was glomming through the data, and to my knowledge, there is no published like percentage or rate or how often this is happening in humans. I would imagine that data is coming, but it's not here yet, at least not as of the date that I am recording this, which is May 20th, 2024. So if you're hearing this after that date, it's entirely possible that they've published something. But at this time, my understanding is that we don't even really have an incidence rate. It's just kind of more of a case study type of situation. Again, it's pretty rare. We did see it in rodents, but not so much in humans. Certainly not in the human clinical trials, which is the published data. It's more incidental reporting. Again, pancreatitis is scary, not something we want, for folks who, again, it's not worth their risk just to lose weight. But again, you should be screened for that, right? And my understanding is that most of the people who have developed pancreatitis either kind of had, and it may not been a family history or something that they have known, but it's just kind of they're genetically kind of predisposed. So I think that those things, again, we should be asking lots of questions. We should be monitoring patients appropriately with these medications, but I don't know that the thyroid cancer or even the pancreatitis are super concerning for most people. Um, I will say the GI or kind of gastroenterological um, side effects can be problematic. People think constipation is not a big deal. People think not eating is maybe not a big deal, but it can be a big deal. And again, I think a lot of this comes down to responsible prescribing, prescribing to the right patient, and appropriate monitoring of these medications, right? I think that people who are on these medications really should be working with a dietitian, on somewhat of a regular basis. Some people like to screen monthly, some people think that that's too much, but I think you should be following up with a dietitian, and you should be kind of following a meal plan, because your hunger cues really aren't going to be there like they were. And when we lose the ability to rely on our hunger cues for when we should eat and how much we should eat, it can be really easy to not eat enough. That can be problematic in the sense that you can get malnourished, right? And I want to be clear. I say this all the time. I always have to correct people on it. You can be obese or overweight and still be malnourished. The two are entirely separate. Malnutrition has nothing to do with your weight per se. It has to do with getting enough nutrients into your body. So if you are not eating enough protein, if you are not eating enough carbs, if you are not able to get enough water, or if you are not able to get enough fiber or vitamins or minerals, then like those things can create malnutrition in you. So I think, you really need to work with a dietitian or at least a provider who knows a decent amount about nutrition and meal planning, to make sure you are actually eating enough through this process. I also think it's really important for physicians or whoever's prescribing it, to monitor folks for GI symptoms. Like, are you having constipation? How often are you having bowel movements? Do we need to get you medication to address this? Are you having any abdominal pain? Because that can be a sign of pancreatitis, but it also can be a sign that you have a bowel blockage or something's kind of not quite right. They slow down the empty. Everybody talks about the gastric emptying, which is the emptying in from your stomach into your small intestine, but they slow down the entire GI tube. I mean, your GI tract is basically a long tube from your mouth to your anus. So the whole thing, you slow down one part, you slow down the rest of it. Um, so again, if you're not having regular bowel movements, you can wind up with an impaction or, a bowel blockage or what we call an ileus, which is basically there's not like a physical thing blocking it, but the muscles have stopped moving, which can be really problematic. Again, I think these things are happening. And again, we don't have published rates of how often this is happening. I wish we did. And I'm sure we will. But I think, and it'll probably start to inform protocols and cares much, much better than we have right now. But again, I think a lot of the instances of this that we are seeing at present, at least at the case study level, do appear that these are folks who are kind of two problems. One, they were not monitored appropriately, meaning like nobody was asking them how much they were eating, nobody was asking them how much they were pooping, or the patient wasn't transparent about it. But my suspicion is the former. And they basically wound up in a situation that was dangerous because they weren't eating enough, they weren't pooping often enough, and potentially the dose was too high for them. But also they may not have been an appropriate patient for it in the first place. I think that's something we need to kind of think about too, that as I mentioned, these things are really good at improving that feeling of fullness and satisfaction. They're really good at helping with food noise. To an extent, they probably help insulin resistance if that is an issue for you and your weight. But if those things are not factors for you, then these medications likely are not appropriate for you. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not worth trying. You certainly can, but I think it's worth paying attention to, if you're somebody who doesn't eat a whole lot day to day anyway, who routinely deals with constipation, these things are probably going to make that worse. So, I think there's a lot of nuance in these discussions. And I think, unfortunately, and I will say this is more likely to happen at like weight loss clinics, where you're basically checking in with a nurse once a month, if that, and then there's kind of like a prescriber that's like overarching. Um, those things aren't really regulated. They're not super highly monitored. It's, their goal often, because of these supply issues, is to get you to the highest dose possible as fast as possible, even though you may not really be tolerating it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have kind of fallen into that. And there's kind of like, well, I can't get the lower dose, so I'm just going to take the higher dose and deal with the side effects, right? No, we shouldn't be doing that, right? Like if it's making you not want to eat, or like it's affecting your, I mean, like, bowel movements and regularity of bowel movements varies person to person, but you should be going, a couple of times a week, at the very least. Ideally we want it like, every day or every other day, but a couple of times a week at least. And I've heard horror stories. And again, these are just anecdotes that I've heard from patients, but I've heard people like, I went a week or more and things like that. Again, I think it's happening more often in kind of the more unregulated settings. I think if it's very different to go to a weight loss clinic versus your doctor who knows you, who knows your medical history, who is going to ask you kind of more pointed questions, because they're responsible for the rest of your care, not just this weight loss piece. I think that's another thing that, like weight loss clinics are relying solely on the patient to disclose their whole, medical history. They may not know their whole medical history, right? But or they may not, things that they may not deem relevant to their own medical history. there may just be kind of a miscommunication, whereas a provider who has followed you for some years is going to be much safer about it, because they know you, they know your history. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that I think there's a real value in meeting with a dietitian, at least a handful of times while you're getting started, to make sure that your nutrition is adequate. And I'll be the first to tell you, I'm going to ask you about your poop. That's one of the things I'm going to ask you is like, are you pooping regularly? Like, not a yes or no question. Like, tell me exactly how often, what does it look like? Are you having any pain with it? Like, I'm going to get into those details with you. And I think the more we can get more eyes on the situations with more varying specialties, the better off you're going to be. So, again, that's kind of all I wanted to address for today. I think we're still learning a lot about these medications. Like I said, they work. They're fantastic for a lot of people, but for a lot of people, they just don't tolerate them well, and that's okay. Oh, the last question that I get all the time. Sorry, I'm a bit all over the place today. Um, is, do I have to be on it forever? Right now, the data that we have is that when people lose weight, and they either stop taking the medication or drop down even to like a lower dose, they typically gain that weight back. So the recommendation at this point, yes, is to take it kind of for the long haul. Um, and I kind of have mixed feelings about that, honestly. And this is just my own personal opinion. I can understand why people don't want to take something long term, but I also think, we don't have, to date, these medications included, because they haven't been out long enough. We don't have a long-term solution, or we don't have any method. There's not a single solitary method out there, that produces long-term weight loss. We don't have one. What we do know, generally speaking, is that and that includes like surgeries and things like that. People regain weight on those too. What we do know is that when people lose weight very quickly, it is much more likely to come back. And I think that's kind of another risk of scaling up to a higher dose too fast, or even taking a higher dose than you really need. I think, there's that sweet spot for anybody who's on these medications to where they're going to get the benefits. They're kind of, the food noise is gone. They're noticing improved satiety, but they're still, their gut is functioning the way they're supposed to, i.e. they're pooping as often as they're supposed to. They are, still getting hungry to an extent. And they're not having any like nausea or constipation type issues. And, to me personally, that seems like that's the dose that person should be on. I don't see a reason to force, and this is my opinion, but I don't see a reason to force anyone to a higher dose just because that's the dose that produced the most weight loss in the studies. I think it's super important too to qualify or to clarify that a significant percentage of participants dropped out of the study at that higher dose because of the side effects. So yes, there are people who stuck it out, and yes, they lost more weight than people at lower doses, but a significant percentage of them dropped out because they could not tolerate that dose. So I think it's just kind of important to recognize, as we're, now prescribing this on a population level, that some people may not tolerate those higher doses. And again, to me, I'm always going to be in favor of slower weight loss because I think it's more sustainable. You're not doing anything drastic, which drastic stresses out your body. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Like drastic heat stresses out your body. Drastic cold stresses out your body. Drastic weight loss stresses out your body. And we don't want our bodies stressed out. We want to do everything we can to avoid stressing our bodies out. So that said, to me, I'm always going to be a favor of slower weight loss because one, it stresses your body less, but also you're more likely going to be preserving muscle better, which is important for a lot of reasons. We want, healthy metabolism relies on a decent amount of muscle mass. Healthy joints, healthy bones relies on muscle mass. Losing muscle mass too quickly, your body, one, is going to be super prone to replenishing that. And that's where we see that kind of rebound weight gain. But also, when we preserve the muscle mass, it means that we're kind of targeting the fat. So we're kind of losing what we want, but keeping what we need, if that makes sense. So like I said, I'm always going to be in favor of slower weight loss. It also, is indicative that you're eating enough. But so that's just kind of my 2 cents on it and kind of what my opinion of kind of, what I like to see, how I like to see my patients be managed on it. And again, like somebody like a doctor who knows you and knows you well is going to be much more inclined to kind of, listen to your concerns than like a weight loss clinic is like, well, we don't have the lower dose right now, so we can give you the high one, or you can go somewhere else. And so again, just kind of my 2 cents on that. That said, long term, like again, we don't have that data yet. Whether or not people really tend to come off of it or stay on it. Right now, the answer is kind of, yeah, we anticipate that if you start it, you will be on it long term. But again, I think that, if the problems that these medications are addressing are chronic, right? Like if something like insulin resistance is chronic, if something like food noise is chronic, if something like, cravings or not quite being able to feel full or satisfied, those things are kind of chronic. They've probably been a part of you for decades at this point of your life. Then I don't know that, then it makes sense that we want a long-term solution. I think, kind of like anything, could you try coming off of it? Probably. But if it was like a blood pressure medication, right? Like we wouldn't be telling people to, well, let's do a trial of you off of the blood pressure medication. Most of the time we recommend that people stay on them. Now, sometimes I will say people make significant lifestyle changes and we're like, you know what, maybe, and like, their blood pressure is actually starting to drop. Then yeah, okay, maybe we'll try off of it. But again, I think there's so much nuance that there's just going to be the answer is going to be different for every person that tries it. So I hope that answers most of the questions. Again, I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but I hope that answers most of the questions you all have about this. Again, if there are more, please leave comments and let me know. I know that this is something you all have wanted for a while, so I'm happy to oblige it. I needed to kind of do my own homework first. And again, the situation is ever evolving. So, like I said, it is May 2024. By August, September, October, certainly into 2025, 2026, we may have completely different answers. And if that's the case, I will probably take this down and re-upload, an update. But I think this is pretty complete at this point. It's pretty accurate to kind of what we know so far, and we will continue learning. So, like I said, I hope this has helped answer some questions for you all. Please feel free to ask me more, and I will see you all in the next episode. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.